It was 3:20 a.m., and the lights on the 12th floor of Tower C in the Starling City Digital Economy Industrial Park still burned bright, cutting a sharp, glowing rectangle into the sleeping city below. The industrial park stretched for nearly 3 kilometers along the western bend of the river, a sprawling complex of glass and steel office towers, data center bunkers wrapped in soundproof concrete, and low-rise testing workshops ringed with security fencing topped with anti-climb razor wire. At this hour, every other building in the zone sat shrouded in uniform blackness. Only Tower C's 12th floor blazed unbroken, a lone beacon suspended above the silent arterial roads that fed the park's main gate. A thin layer of early autumn mist curled along the asphalt between the buildings, catching the harsh white LED spill from the office windows and diffusing it into soft, hazy halos that blurred the edges of every concrete planter and metal lamppost scattered across the courtyard below. The air outside carried the faint, metallic tang of cooling server exhaust drifting upward from the basement data center intake vents, mixed with the damp, earthy scent of river fog rolling in from the waterway half a kilometer to the south. Ethan Hayes leaned back in his ergonomic chair, his gaze fixed on the undulating performance curves flickering across his triple-monitor setup, and rubbed his gritty, stinging eyes with the pads of his calloused fingertips. Skin roughened over 6 years of constant typing, dotted with tiny pale indentations left by the plastic edges of keyboard keys pressed 10,000 times a day. 6 years. He had lost count of how many nights he had sat alone at this hour, surrounded by nothing but lines of code and monitoring dashboards that cycled endlessly through latency metrics, concurrent user load heatmaps, database read/write throughput graphs, and error log alert streams that only flared red once every 3 or 4 hours, a quiet testament to how rigorously he had refined the underlying architecture over months of iterative testing. He tilted his head backward to stare at the suspended ceiling above his workstation, watching a single fluorescent tube flicker on a slow, steady rhythm, its low electrical hum blending seamlessly with the distant whine of the air conditioning unit that circulated chilled air through the open-plan office floor 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to keep hundreds of high-spec servers and developer workstations from overheating under constant load. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows that spanned the entire northern wall of the 12th floor, the city lay dormant, its skyline a soft, blurred silhouette against the indigo dark streaked with thin wispy clouds that glinted pale silver under the faint glow of a half-moon hidden behind a bank of haze. The residential districts to the east of the industrial park were completely dark, every apartment window shuttered against the late night, save for a handful of scattered pinpricks of light marking insomniacs, night shift nurses coming home from the downtown hospital, or parents tending to crying infants in small suburban row houses. Every few minutes, a night shift freight truck rumbled across the 8-lane elevated highway that cut horizontally between the industrial zone and the residential suburbs in the distance, its oversized headlights streaking the blackness with flowing ribbons of tangerine light that stretched hundreds of meters before fading into the fog, followed by the low, resonant growl of a heavy diesel engine that echoed off the concrete retaining walls lining the highway embankment for 10 full seconds, after the vehicle itself vanished from sight. Occasionally, a lone sedan would zip past the trucks, its headlights thinner and sharper, driven by a delivery driver rushing late-night food orders or a corporate worker pulling an all-nighter at another tech firm scattered across the city's digital district. On his primary center screen sat a document titled Starling City Smart Traffic Digital Twin Platform Technical Specification V6.3_Final Review, formatted with crisp technical heading hierarchies, embedded UML architecture diagrams, annotated database entity relationship schematics, and color-coded performance benchmark tables spanning 347 densely packed pages of precise technical prose. The document covered every conceivable layer of the platform's stack without omission, starting from the bottom-level spatiotemporal distributed database selection benchmark comparisons that pitted 5 competing open-source and commercial database engines against one another under simulated peak city traffic load, moving upward through data cleansing pipeline orchestration logic, real-time roadside sensor data stream deserialization modules, edge computing gateway communication protocols mid. Tier road network simulation physics engines built to replicate vehicle acceleration, deceleration, lane changing, and traffic light signal timing dynamics with centimeter-level spatial accuracy. And topping out at the upper layer, citywide visualization front-end rendering engine paired with predictive machine learning algorithm models trained on 3 full years of historical Starling City traffic flow data pulled from thousands of traffic cameras, loop detectors, and wireless vehicle positioning beacons spread across every arterial road, residential side street, and highway interchange within the municipal boundary. Every single technical decision recorded behind those pages had been run through at least 3 to 5 exhaustive rounds of mathematical, cross-team argument, stress test failure analysis, and iterative revision that dragged on for weeks at a time, forcing Ethan to mediate disagreements between back-end engineers, data scientists, embedded hardware specialists, and front-end visualization developers who each advocated for competing architectural trade-offs that balanced latency, storage cost, computational overhead, and long-term maintainability in wildly different ways. More than once, cross-team debates had stretched late into the night, leaving Ethan drafting compromised technical frameworks at 2 or 3 in the morning to reconcile clashing design philosophies before the next day's stand-up meeting. He had spent 4 full calendar months leading a tightly knit team of 8 people to build the entire digital twin platform from initial requirement gathering to near final production-ready iteration, surviving almost entirely on lukewarm takeout coffee brewed from cheap bulk beans stocked in the break room vending machine, cold fried rice, and noodle boxes delivered by 24-hour food delivery services stacked beside his desk, and snatched 10 to 20-minute naps slumped awkwardly across the worn fabric couch tucked into the corner of the tiny staff break room whenever the project's progress hit a stable checkpoint that allowed him to step away from his monitors for a handful of minutes. The municipal government contract for the Starling City Smart Traffic Project was valued at exactly $16.8 million, a 9-figure deal that represented the single largest client win Cloudscape Technologies had secured in its 7 years of operating as an urban digital infrastructure development firm. If Cloudscape won the formal public bidding set to take place 1 week after Ethan's planned handover period concluded, the firm would instantly catapult itself into the undisputed first tier of nationwide urban digital infrastructure providers, granting them access to a pipeline of municipal smart city tender opportunities across 12 neighboring metropolitan regions, multi-million-dollar venture capital pre-IPO investment rounds, and the industry credibility needed to poach top-tier senior engineering talent from rival tech corporations operating within Starling City and beyond. Failure to secure the bid, by contrast, would stall the company's planned public listing timeline by at least 2 full years, scare off multiple tentative institutional investors already circling the firm's funding round, and force leadership to implement sweeping budget cuts that would trigger mass layoffs across the engineering, product, and client services departments. Ethan typed in the final set of stress test parameter tweaks into the terminal window anchored at the bottom of his central monitor, adjusting simulated peak-hour vehicle concurrency caps, sensor data throttling thresholds, and cache and validation cycle timers to align perfectly with the hard performance limits outlined in the municipal bidding tender documents. Then press the keyboard shortcut to save all modified configuration files to the project's central Git repository. A pale gray system prompt popped up automatically in the bottom right corner of the screen, crisp white sans serif text reading, Git commit successful. Commit hash 7A392B. He hovered his mouse cursor over the commit hash string for a beat, recalling the hundreds of prior commit IDs he had memorized over the 4 months of project development, each one marking a late-night bug fix, architectural rewrite, or performance optimization milestone he had single-handedly shepherded into the main code branch without external oversight. 73,000 entirely new lines of purpose-built production code, written from scratch specifically to handle the unique spatial and temporal data requirements of Starling City's traffic simulation logic, plus 90,000 lines of refactored, optimized legacy internal middleware modules repurposed and retooled to integrate seamlessly with the new digital twin stack, 160,000 lines of fully tested, audit-ready production code in total, all traceable to detailed task tickets logged in the company's project management platform, each line annotated with inline code comments explaining functional purpose, edge case handling, and future maintenance considerations for any engineer taking over the repository after his departure. That massive codebase already represented the 32nd major feature commit he had personally contributed to this single project alone, not counting hundreds of minor hotfix commits, documentation updates, and configuration adjustments logged under his developer account over the 4-month development cycle. He pushed his office chair backward with a quiet scrape of plastic wheel casters against the industrial-grade low-pile gray carpet covering the entire office floor, stood up slowly to stretch his stiff shoulders and spine, his joints popping softly after hours of unbroken hunching over the keyboard, and walked the 10-meter distance separating his workstation from the floor-to-ceiling north-facing windows, his socked feet padding silently across the carpet, the only sound apart from the constant hum of cooling systems and distant highway traffic. His reflection stared back at him from the double-glazed tempered glass, slightly distorted by the faint layer of nighttime condensation that had formed along the interior surface of the window panes. A 31-year-old man draped in a faded dark gray cotton hoodie frayed at the cuffs and hem from years of repeated washing. His posture permanently slightly hunched forward from 6 consecutive years of spending 10 to 14 hours daily bent over a mechanical keyboard and bank of monitors. A faint, unshaven stubble of blue-black shadow lining his jaw and upper lip that he had not found the spare time to shave over the past 3 chaotic weeks of crunch time for the Starling project's final technical review draft. Strands of soft, dark brown hair fell loosely across his forehead, unbrushed and slightly matted from repeatedly running his palms through it during hours of concentrated debugging sessions, and dark purple bruise-like shadows pooled beneath his hazel eyes, deepened by weeks of cumulative sleep deprivation that left his skin dull and lacking its usual faint warmth. 31 years old on paper, but the unrelenting workload, constant mental strain, and endless late nights had carved premature wear into his features, making him look far closer to 35 to any casual observer who did not know his actual age. He was tired. Bone-deep, marrow-deep tired, a heavy, leaden exhaustion that settled permanently in his limbs, weighed down his skull behind his eyes, and lingered in his chest like a heavy stone no amount of hastily snatched break-room naps or weekend sleep-ins could fully dispel. The fatigue was not merely physical weariness from lack of rest. It was a quiet, gradual emotional depletion that had crept up on him incrementally over the span of 6 years, masked by the relentless forward momentum of project deadlines, technical roadblocks requiring immediate resolution, and the unspoken promise of company loyalty and future advancement that Victor Zhou, Cloudescape's founding CTO, had pressed into him on his very first day walking through the firm's glass lobby entrance as a fresh-faced, newly graduated back-end engineer with nothing but a laptop, a stack of academic computer science textbooks, and a head full of ambitious ideas about building scalable urban digital infrastructure systems. He could still replay that exact moment in his mind with crystal clarity, as if it had unfolded only yesterday rather than 6 years prior. Victor had clapped a heavy, warm palm firmly against his shoulder in the cramped server room that occupied half of the original 3-floor office space Cloudescape had leased back in those early startup days, rows of whirring rack-mounted servers stretching wall to wall around them, the air thick with hot machine exhaust and the sharp metallic smell of circuit boards and cooling fans, and spoken in a gruff, earnest tone that carried complete sincerity at the time. Ethan. Technical skill is what keeps us standing when every startup around us collapses under poorly built architecture and half-baked engineering shortcuts. Go build something great that matters to cities and their people. The company has your back, no matter what hurdles you hit along the way. He had carried those words close to his chest like a personal mission statement for all 6 subsequent years, repeating them silently to himself during every grueling all-nighter, every tense cross-department negotiation, every instance where he sacrificed personal time with his wife Clara to resolve critical production failures or hit non-negotiable client deadlines. In that half-decade of dedicated service, He had climbed steadily and entirely on technical merit alone, from entry-level junior back-end engineer to the firm's sole head of architecture, a leadership role that placed full ownership of every core internal technical system under his oversight without any dedicated junior architect staff to delegate complex design work to. Cloudscape's proprietary distributed middleware system that formed the backbone of all their client deployments. Their petabyte-scale big data real-time processing pipelines built to ingest unstructured municipal sensor data streams at millions of records per minute. Their fault-tolerant, high-availability multi-region server infrastructure engineered to maintain 99.99% uptime during peak municipal service loads. Nearly every foundational technical framework powering the entire business bore his direct design fingerprints, from initial whiteboard drafting to final production deployment and long-term iterative maintenance. The custom systems he had architected and built single-handedly over those 6 years had powered 3 separate 9-figure municipal smart city projects across different regional jurisdictions, boasted an industry-leading 95% client renewal rate as satisfied municipal governments returned to Cloudscape for expanded digital infrastructure upgrades year after year, and consistently ranked among the 3 lowest failure rate production architectures measured by independent third-party tech audit firms operating within the national smart city development sector, a statistic that Cloudscape's sales team leaned on heavily during every client pitch to differentiate their offerings from competitors with shakier, less rigorously engineered back-end stacks. For 6 long years, Ethan had clung firmly to an unshakable core belief forged from his early professional experiences, that consistent, high-quality hard work poured into building tangible, valuable technical systems would always be seen, acknowledged, and rewarded by company leadership, that genuine, demonstrable expertise capable of solving complex industry technical pain points would command unwavering respect and fair advancement within the organization he had helped grow from a tiny 3-floor startup to a 12-floor industrial park enterprise with over 200 full-time employees across engineering, sales, operations, finance, and human resources departments. He had never once entertained the possibility that the unwritten verbal promises of loyalty, advancement, and mutual gratitude exchanged between himself and Victor all those years ago could carry a strict, unspoken expiration date stamped precisely at the 6-year mark of his employment tenure, set to lapse the moment Victor's cousin Jason arrived back in Starling City with a polished, inflated Silicon Valley resume and a family connection that outweighed 6 years of irreplaceable technical labor and institutional knowledge. As he gathered his worn canvas laptop bag, slung over the arm of his office chair, stuffed his charging cables, a half-empty water bottle, and a dog-eared printed copy of the Starling project technical spec into its main compartment, and prepared to head home through the quiet industrial park streets to the small suburban townhouse he shared with Clara, his smartphone vibrated once against the hard plastic surface of his desk, the screen lighting up with a new text message notification from his wife's contact card, the message text reading simply, "Another late one? Soup's still warm on the stove. Don't forget to eat it when you get in." The soup had been simmering in a covered ceramic pot on their kitchen stove for more than 3 hours, Clara having prepared it before she'd gone to bed at 11 o'clock that night, knowing full well Ethan would not return home until well past 3:30 or 4 in the morning after wrapping up his final round of stress test configuration tweaks for the Starling project specification document. He tapped the screen to unlock the phone, navigated to their private message thread, sent a small cartoon sticker of a man carrying a laptop walking toward a front door labeled "Be Home Soon," then typed out a supplementary line of plain text to ease the quiet worry he knew lingered in Clara's mind every time he pulled multi-hour overtime shifts deep into the early morning. "Project's almost wrapped. 1 more week and I'll be back to normal hours. No more 3 a.m. office nights, I promise." He had sent that exact same line of reassurance dozens of times over the 4 months of Starling project crunch, each time fully believing the deadline would hold and regular working hours would resume as soon as the handover period concluded, blind to the fact that leadership had already finalized plans to remove him from his architecture role entirely before the week even drew to a close. Clara replied less than 10 seconds later with a simple soft hug emoji, no additional text required. A silent gesture that encapsulated 6 full years of marriage spent adjusting to Ethan's erratic, deadline-driven work schedule. Her patience worn thin by the endless repeating cycle of his vague reassurances of soon and one more week that never quite materialized into consistent, balanced work-life separation. A dull, heavy, guilty tightness settled deep in Ethan's chest as he stared at the emoji on his screen, a sharp twinge of remorse over all the missed family dinners, canceled weekend hiking trips they had planned together, and quiet evenings spent alone at home while he remained trapped at the office debugging critical technical failures. But the uncomfortable sensation dissolved rapidly beneath the overwhelming hum of anxious anticipation swirling in his mind over the upcoming final bidding round for the $16.8 million Starling City contract, a project he had poured every spare ounce of energy into perfecting for months on end. Desperate to see his technical vision fully realized and deliver a landmark client win for the company he had helped build from its infancy. He had no inkling whatsoever that on that exact same night, parallel to his solitary late-night grind on the 12th floor of Tower C, a closed-door conversation centered entirely around his forced removal from Clouscape's architecture leadership team was unfolding in Victor Joe's spacious, warmly lit residential study located in an upscale gated lakefront neighborhood across the entire western half of Starling City, a 40-minute drive away from the digital industrial park where Ethan labored alone into the early morning hours. In Victor's study, floor-length walnut bookshelves lined every wall, packed tightly with leather-bound business management hardcovers, technical engineering reference texts, bound annual industry smart city audit reports, and framed glossy photographs capturing Victor shaking hands with venture capital partners, municipal government officials, and startup industry keynote speakers at national tech conferences hosted across the country. A polished solid black sandalwood tea table stood centered in the room, its surface etched with delicate hand-carved river landscape patterns, upon which a small ceramic clay pot filled with aged white tea simmered slowly over a low-temperature electric tea heater. Thin wispy white steam curling upward continuously from the pot's narrow spout to fog the cool air of the room scented with sandalwood furniture polish and dried osmanthus blossoms arranged in a small porcelain vase on the table's edge. Seated across from Victor in a plush hand-carved mahogany armchair upholstered with cream silk cushioning was Jason Joe, Victor's maternal cousin, fresh off an international trans-Pacific flight returning from California barely 1 week prior. His luggage still partially unpacked in the guest bedroom down the hallway of Victor's lakeside mansion. Jason held a prestigious Master of Business Administration degree from Stanford University's Graduate School of Business, a credential he prominently featured at the very top of every version of his professional resume distributed to investors and corporate board members, and had spent 2 full years employed as a mid-tier product manager at a moderately sized artificial intelligence startup operating within Silicon Valley's Bay Area tech corridor. His glossy, professionally revised resume boasted bold bullet point language claiming he had led end-to-end user growth strategy for a 10 million monthly active user consumer AI product, though in cold, unvarnished reality. The vast majority of his day-to-day job responsibilities at the Silicon Valley startup had consisted solely of manually optimizing basic web-based data visualization dashboards for internal stakeholder meetings and drafting short, generic marketing copy for simple A/B test variant landing page trials with negligible impact on overall product user retention or revenue growth, no deep architectural design work, no large-scale distributed system development, no client-tender technical delivery experience whatsoever to back up his inflated self-marketed professional narrative. Come on, Vic. Let's cut straight to the polished corporate talking points we feed investors. No sugarcoating between family, Jason said, leaning casually backward into the silk armchair cushion with one ankle crossed loosely over his opposite knee, his long, well-manicured index finger tracing slow circular loops around the glazed ceramic rim of his white teacup, his tone dripping with the smooth, rehearsed confidence of someone who had spent 2 years practicing persuasive investor-facing rhetoric without ever engaging with underlying engineering complexity. Cloudscape's entire core architecture framework is so painfully engineer-brained it's practically invisible to the capital market stakeholders holding our pre-IPO funding purse strings. The venture capital investors I sat down for a dinner meeting with 3 nights ago, they all told me the same thing. They can clearly see your technical back-end engineering output is objectively impressive on paper, but they cannot parse a single word of the dense technical jargon Ethan spouts during every investor due diligence presentation. You know what truly moves the needle when you're marching toward a public listing and attempting to secure 9-figure institutional funding rounds? Compelling, marketable brand narratives that translate easily to non-technical board members and outside investors, not thousands upon thousands of lines of dense, incomprehensible back-end code locked away in private Git repositories that no finance team member can read or evaluate for commercial value. Victor lifted his own matching white porcelain teacup to his lips, taking a slow, deliberate small sip of the simmered aged white tea, but he remained completely silent, offering no verbal rebuttal or agreement to his cousin's deliberately dismissive assessment of Ethan's 6 years of foundational technical work for Cloudscape. He knew with unshakable certainty deep down that Ethan's unparalleled technical ability formed Cloudscape's irreplaceable ballast, the heavy, stabilizing weight that kept the entire corporate vessel steady and upright through every storm of client tender deadlines, critical production outages, tight budget crunches, and industry market volatility that had threatened to sink smaller competing smart city tech firms over the past half-decade. But ballast, solid and functional as it was, could not deliver slick investor dinner conversation, could not sit through multi-course wine tastings with venture capital partners to schmooze potential funding commitments, could not spend weekend afternoons playing corporate golf with sitting board members to cultivate personal business relationships that translated to favorable internal restructuring votes and pre-IPO funding approvals. Jason, by stark contrast, possessed every polished interpersonal skill Ethan lacked, every superficial corporate charm point required to navigate the glitzy, relationship-driven world of startup capital fundraising, even if his hands-on technical engineering experience was paper-thin and largely ceremonial. More importantly, beyond any professional skill gap or interpersonal advantage Jason brought to the table, Jason was blood family, Victor's direct maternal cousin. A connection Victor prioritized above the years of loyal labor Ethan had poured into building Cloudscape's entire technical infrastructure from the ground up. Family loyalty outweighed institutional debt to a hardworking non-family employee in Victor's internal moral calculus, a biased priority he had never openly acknowledged to anyone outside his immediate household circle. I've sat down and talked the full restructuring plan over at length with Zhang and Chen on the company's board of directors, Victor said finally, setting his teacup down against the sandalwood table surface with a soft, muted porcelain clink that cut through the quiet hiss of the tea heater, his voice lowered to a measured, confidential volume to prevent any chance of the conversation drifting through the study's closed wooden door to household staff in the kitchen down the hall. They formally signed off on the full architecture department internal restructuring proposal I circulated last week. You'll step into the official role of Associate Director of Architecture first, a senior leadership title that will feature prominently in all pre-IPO investor organizational charts handed out during due diligence rounds. Your core responsibilities will cover all external client technical presentations, investor relations technical deep dives, board strategy briefings, and every single outward-facing corporate technical communications task that Ethan currently handles alone. As for the actual hands-on technical implementation, back-end architecture design, production incident resolution, and day-to-day engineering delivery side of the department's workload, all implementation work will be fully covered by the dedicated architecture team I plan to personally recruit and bring on board within the next 30 days. Jason cut Victor off mid-sentence without a trace of polite deference, his tone sharp and dismissive as he dismissed Ethan's entire 6 years of iterative architectural development work as outdated, obsolete methodology unfit for Cloudscape's post-restructuring corporate future. Ethan's entire problem-solving framework boils down to the same primitive brute force workaround every entry-level back-end engineer learns in their first year on the job. Just throw more physical server hardware and exponentially more bloated lines of code at every minor performance bottleneck that arises, with zero focus on streamlined resource efficiency or modern cloud-native development paradigms. Silicon Valley moved wholesale to fully abstracted cloud-native serverless infrastructure architecture years ago, scrapping bare metal distributed database deployments entirely to cut operational overhead and scale dynamically on demand. Ethan's still wasting thousands of dollars monthly on physical bare metal server racks running clunky on-premises distributed database clusters when every comparable competitor in our industry has migrated entirely to managed cloud database services. His technical methodology is hopelessly outdated, stuck in a 5-year-old engineering mindset that can't keep pace with investor demands for lean, cost-efficient cloud infrastructure narratives to showcase during IPO roadshows. Victor's brow furrowed tightly. Jason's oversimplified, factually inaccurate criticism of Ethan's award-recognized distributed database optimization work sitting heavy and uncomfortable on his tongue. A surge of instinctual correction rising unbidden in his throat. He wanted to immediately interject and set the record straight, to lay out the widely acknowledged industry benchmark status Ethan's custom bare metal distributed database tuning algorithms had earned across national smart city tech conferences. To explain that the on-premises bare metal deployment strategy Ethan had engineered was a deliberate, client-mandated security compliance requirement for municipal government data workloads that could not be migrated to third-party managed cloud databases under strict local data sovereignty legislation governing Starling City's public sector digital infrastructure contracts. Details Jason had not bothered to research or understand before leveling his sweeping judgment on Ethan's core technical design choices. But Victor swallowed the corrective argument whole before a single word could escape his mouth, suppressing the urge to defend his most valuable technical employee to appease his cousin's desire for a senior leadership position within the firm. He needed Jason's polished investor-facing communication skills to lock in the critical pre-IPO venture capital funding round that would determine Cloudscape's financial survival over the next 2 fiscal years. The granular technical implementation details of the company's back-end systems were secondary in his mind. As long as no catastrophic production outages caught fire and triggered public client scandal to derail the bidding timeline and IPO preparation cycle. If minor technical performance inefficiencies cropped up after Ethan's departure, he reasoned, some anonymous mid-tier engineer remaining on the team would be capable of patching the gaps well enough to avoid high-visibility public failures for the duration of the pre-IPO push. What exactly are we planning to do about Ethan once the restructuring officially takes effect? Jason asked, a faint, unmistakable hungry eagerness sharpening the edges of his voice. His eyes fixed intently on Victor's face as he waited to hear the finalized plan to remove the incumbent head of architecture and clear the leadership path for his own promotion to associate director of the department. Victor fell into a long stretch of weighted silence for several full seconds. Thin white steam curling upward from the mouth of his ceramic teacup to blur the fine lines of his facial features as he deliberated over the most painless way to force Ethan out of the company without triggering internal engineering team backlash or legal severance complications. I will schedule a private one-on-one closed-door meeting with him in my office in 2 days' time, break down the board's restructuring decision frame by frame, and extend a generous, respectable severance package offer to incentivize him to submit a voluntary resignation letter without formal termination proceedings that could leave negative marks on both his professional record and Cloudscape's corporate HR documentation. We will frame the entire separation as a mutually amicable strategic realignment to align with the company's new pre-IPO growth stage, rather than an involuntary layoff driven by internal leadership restructuring to make room for new senior management hires. What if he flat-out refuses to voluntarily resign once we lay out the restructuring news and severance offer? Jason pressed, curious about the contingency plan Victor had prepared to handle potential pushback from the firm's most senior technical architect. He will say yes without hesitation, Victor replied with quiet, unshakable certainty, the absolute confidence of a man who believed he had fully decoded Ethan's personality and motivations down to the smallest predictable detail. Convinced he understood the quiet engineer completely after 6 years of working alongside him daily. In Victor's narrow, oversimplified mental model of Ethan's identity, he was nothing more than a docile, compliant, good quiet worker who would never rock the corporate boat or raise disruptive pushback against executive leadership decisions. He pictured Ethan as the predictable, unassuming employee who always wore faded plaid flannel shirts or frayed gray cotton hoodies to the office every single day, who spoke slowly, calmly, and minimally during all internal cross-team meetings without ever raising his voice to argue with executive leadership, who volunteered to pull the latest overnight overtime shifts to resolve critical production bugs without filing formal overtime compensation claims, and who never voiced a single complaint about unmanageable workloads, last-minute deadline crunches, or limited internal budget allocation for engineering tooling and infrastructure upgrades. If Klausgate presented him with a decent, financially competitive severance payout and framed the exit as a dignified, graceful professional transition rather than a forced dismissal, Victor fully believed Ethan would pack up his desk without protest and walk away quietly without stirring up dissent among the rest of the engineering staff or leaking negative internal restructuring news to industry competitors or municipal client contacts. Victor had zero comprehension of the quiet, unyielding steel woven deep into Ethan's bones beneath his reserved, soft-spoken exterior, an unbreakable core forged from 6 years of overcoming relentless technical roadblocks, mediating endless cross-team engineering conflicts, and carrying the entire weight of the company's technical survival on his shoulders without a single senior leader stepping in to share the burden when crises arose. He had misjudged Ethan's quiet demeanor as passivity, failing to recognize it as deliberate, focused restraint reserved for professional courtesy, masking a sharp, methodical mind that calculated every consequence of every action with cold, precise mathematical clarity. 2 full days after that late-night tea conversation in Victor's lakeside study, in the middle of a bright, unremarkable weekday afternoon when the entire engineering department was fully staffed and immersed in routine sprint work, Ethan sat hunched over his workstation finalizing a complete dependency mapping pass on the sprawling Starling City Smart Traffic Project microservice topology diagram, tracing every cross-module API call, database foreign key relationship, and third-party external service integration link across the platform's 7 interconnected core service layers to flag unaddressed circular dependency risks that could trigger cascading system failure under peak concurrency load, when his desk landline telephone rang once, its shrill electronic ringtone cutting through the constant low hum of keyboard typing and monitor cooling fans filling the open-plan 12th floor office space. "Ethan. My office. Now." Victor's voice filtered through the telephone receiver steady, flat, and professionally neutral as always, the standard crisp corporate tone he reserved for formal administrative requests and official executive announcements. But Ethan instantly detected a subtle, critical element missing from his speech pattern: the casual, warm undercurrent of quiet camaraderie that had always underlaid every previous conversation between the two men over 6 years of shared startup growth, replaced entirely by a carefully manufactured, rigid politeness that felt cold and artificial, a clear signal that the impending meeting carried serious, non-routine weight that had nothing to do with standard project progress check-ins or technical troubleshooting discussions. He set his mechanical keyboard mouse down gently atop the mouse pad, smoothed out the crumpled fabric collar of his faded gray hoodie with one quick hand motion to present a slightly more put-together appearance before meeting the CTO, pushed his office chair backward once more, and walked down the long, wide open-plan office floor lined with dozens of identical engineering workstations partitioned by low frosted glass dividers separating individual developer zones. Bright golden afternoon sunlight slanted through the north-facing floor-to-ceiling windows at a sharp diagonal angle, spilling across the polished black plastic surfaces of hundreds of mechanical keyboards resting on desktops, gilding the edges of laptop screens and scattered paper printouts strewn across every workstation surface as his colleagues typed rapidly through their assigned sprint tasks. A handful of senior engineers glanced upward briefly from their monitors as he passed between the rows of desks, their expressions flicking with quiet, unspoken curiosity at the unprompted summons to Victor's private executive office in the middle of the workday. Then they quickly dropped their gazes back to their code editors, sensing the heavy, tense atmosphere clinging to Ethan's shoulders as he walked past their stations without exchanging a single word or brief nod of acknowledgement. When he crossed the threshold into Victor's walled, private executive office at the far eastern end of the 12th floor, the entire room struck him instantly as far more rigidly formal than the relaxed, casual meeting space he had grown accustomed to visiting over 6 years for impromptu technical problem-solving chats and project celebration discussions. The heavy solid walnut tea table Victor regularly pulled out for casual, low-stakes one-on-one conversations with lead engineers had been completely cleared of all scattered notebooks, printed technical diagrams, and half-empty coffee mugs, its wooden surface polished to a mere shine free of any clutter or casual debris. A brand-new, unused set of delicate Celadon porcelain teaware Ethan had never once laid eyes on in any prior visit sat neatly arranged on a carved wooden tea tray positioned dead center of the tabletop, paired alongside an ornately wrapped rectangular tin of premium Jin May black tea imported directly from Wui Mountain in Fujian Province, its packaging embossed with gold foil floral patterns and handwritten calligraphy branding identifying it as a rare limited harvest batch gifted to Victor by a municipal government bureau chief during a prior client dinner event months earlier. The usual stack of technical audit reports, printed investor slide decks, and server infrastructure capacity planning binders that perpetually covered every horizontal surface of Victor's office had all been cleared away and stacked neatly out of sight in a wooden storage cabinet against the far wall, leaving the room stripped bare of any casual, lived-in clutter that would signal an unplanned, spontaneous chat between old colleagues. "Sit," Victor instructed flatly, sliding into the armchair positioned opposite Ethan's designated seat at the tea table and immediately launching into the ritualized multi-step tea brewing process without pausing to exchange a single preliminary greeting or ask how the Starling project's final technical specification revisions were progressing. He moved through the precise sequence of warming the porcelain teacups with hot water, measuring out exact quantities of dried Jin May tea leaves from the ornate tin into the clay brewing pot, and pouring preheated temperature-controlled water over the leaves with smooth, rehearsed, almost performative movements that read to Ethan as scripted rather than genuine casual hospitality. Every motion carried the stiff precision of a man who had practiced this exact tea service routine the night prior in his lakeside study to stage a carefully orchestrated, ceremonial goodbye conversation designed to soften the blow of delivering the forced resignation demand to his most senior architect. Ethan lowered himself into the opposite armchair slowly, his eyes darting microscopically across every small, intentional detail laid out across the tea table surface to piece together the unspoken subtext of the staged meeting unfolding before him. He registered the subtle digital temperature readout on the side of the electric tea heater tucked beneath the table, displaying a steady 95 degrees Celsius water temperature, held constant for brewing the delicate black tea leaves. The strict two-pour brewing sequence Victor adhered to without deviation, the first pour of hot water solely to rinse the surface dust from the dried tea leaves and discard the weak initial steep, the second measured pour to brew the fully concentrated serving, intended for drinking. Victor executed every single step of the rigid brewing protocol without once lifting his gaze to meet Ethan's hazel eyes directly, his stare fixed unwaveringly on the clay brewing pot and porcelain cups as he manipulated the tea utensils, deliberately avoiding any direct eye contact that would force him to confront the emotional weight of the betrayal he was about to deliver to the man who had built the company's entire technical foundation single-handedly over 6 years of relentless labor. "Try this cup." A close personal business friend brought this limited batch Jin May back directly from Wui Mountain last spring harvest, Victor said, sliding the small porcelain teacup filled with glowing amber-hued brewed tea across the polished sandalwood tabletop toward Ethan's waiting hands, his voice artificially warm and affable, a practiced veneer masking the cold executive decision he had finalized alongside his cousin Jason and the board of directors 2 nights prior. Ethan lifted the delicate Celadon teacup between his thumb and forefinger, the rich, thick honeyed floral aroma of the steeped black tea curling upward into his nostrils to fill his sinuses the moment the cup drew near his face. He took one tiny, restrained sip of the hot liquid, registering the perfectly calibrated temperature Victor had maintained through the brewing process, not scaldingly hot enough to burn the throat, precisely warm enough to unlock every layered floral and caramel flavor compound locked within the dried tea leaves, a tiny, hyper-specific detail that sent a quiet, sharp chill snaking down his spine to settle heavy in the pit of his stomach. No executive leader would meticulously regulate water temperature to within a single degree Celsius and stage an elaborate formal tea ceremony complete with rare premium tea wear for a casual, unplanned check-in conversation about project progress or minor technical roadblocks. This entire carefully curated tea ritual had been engineered from the very first heating of the water to the final slide of the teacup across the table as a symbolic, ceremonial preamble to delivering devastating professional news that would unravel every ounce of Ethan's 6 years of dedicated service to Clouscape Technologies. 6 full years working side by side at Clouscape, hasn't it? Victor set his own filled teacup back down against the polished table surface with a crisp, sharp porcelain click that cut through the heavy, charged silence hanging thick in the air of the enclosed office room. Launching into a nostalgic opening monologue designed to lull Ethan into a false sense of shared camaraderie before delivering the restructuring blow. Time flies faster than anyone could predict when you're building a startup from the ground up together. I still vividly remember your very first day walking through our lobby front doors as a brand new junior back-end engineer fresh out of university. Back then, we only occupied 3 cramped floors of Tower A in this industrial park. Barely 40 total employees split across engineering and sales teams. Now we lease all 12 floors of Tower C outright, with over 200 full-time staff across every department and multi-million-dollar municipal client contracts stretching across the entire regional smart city market. 6 years and 3 months, to be exact. Ethan corrected Victor's vague timeline quietly, his tone flat and devoid of emotion, his memory retaining the precise exact date of his first employment start down to the calendar month. A trivial detail Victor had long forgotten amid his endless cycle of investor meetings, board briefings, and family business scheming with Jason. He had counted every single month, every single late night, every single sacrifice he had made for the company's growth. And the minor miscalculation of his tenure link stung as a quiet indicator that Victor had never truly valued the granular effort he poured into Clouscape day in and day out for half a decade. Right, over 6 full years total service, Victor brushed off the precise correction without acknowledgement, continuing his nostalgic preamble with a rehearsed sentimental cadence. You are one of Clouscape's original founding technical minds, the core engineer who built every critical backend system that allowed us to scale from a tiny startup to the regional industry leader we are today. The company would never have reached its current market standing without your consistent technical contributions and round-the-clock dedication to resolving every critical production crisis that crossed our desks over these past years. You have to know I have always thought of you as a trusted brother, not merely a subordinate employee on the engineering leadership team. Ethan remained completely silent in response to the hollow fraternal label, his jaw set tight as he recognized the predictable linguistic pattern embedded in corporate executive dialogue. Every time a senior leader prefaces a difficult, damaging announcement with the phrase, "I consider you like family," or "you're like a brother to me," the inevitable conjunction, but would follow immediately after to deliver a devastating, self-serving business decision that prioritized corporate financial gain over personal loyalty and employee well-being. Sure enough, Victor leaned forward slightly across the tea table, his vocal tone shifting abruptly and jarringly from warm, sentimental nostalgia to brisk, detached corporate pragmatism with zero transitional softening, dropping all pretense of genuine personal camaraderie to lay out the board's pre-planned restructuring demand without further delay. But here is the unavoidable reality we are facing as a company moving forward, Ethan. Clouscape has crossed a critical developmental threshold that demands sweeping organizational restructuring to align with our imminent pre-IPO funding round scheduled to kick off early next fiscal quarter. The board of directors has formally mandated that we expand our senior executive leadership bench to showcase a more diverse, internationally experienced management roster to all incoming venture capital investors participating in the funding round. To meet that investor-facing requirement, we need to bring on board senior management personnel with established cross-border capital communications experience and global Silicon Valley industry perspective. Exactly the background Jason brings to the table as a Stanford MBA with 2 years of product leadership experience in California's tech ecosystem. He paused for a beat, pretending to deliberate over the gentlest possible phrasing to frame the criticism targeting Ethan's professional communication style, carefully selecting words that framed Ethan's reserved demeanor as a liability to the company's IPO fundraising efforts rather than a deliberate, focused personality trait that prioritized technical accuracy over flashy investor grandstanding. No single person on the executive board or engineering leadership team questions your raw, unmatched technical ability to design and implement complex distributed urban infrastructure systems. That fact is universally acknowledged across every department of the company. But your consistent communication style during investor-facing technical deep dives is far too reserved and overly granular, heavy with niche back-end engineering jargon that non-technical finance stakeholders cannot follow or translate into tangible commercial revenue value. Even our internal in-house investment team struggles to parse your technical presentation slides without hours of supplementary follow-up explanation to connect architectural design choices to bottom-line client profitability metrics. That persistent communication gap becomes a severe organizational liability during the high-stakes visibility window of an IPO push, when every investor interaction shapes their willingness to commit large institutional funding sums to our corporate growth plan. Ethan's fingers tightened involuntarily around the curved handle of his Celadon teacup, his knuckles whitening slightly under the pressure of his grip as he suppressed the instinct to launch into a detailed, fact-based rebuttal dismantling Victor's baseless accusation of poor communication skills. Over 6 full years of employment at Cloudscape, he had personally delivered 27 formal external technical presentations to municipal government client panels, third-party industry audit firms, and venture capital investor groups without a single formal complaint filed about unclear technical messaging or incomprehensible jargon. He had written every single slide deck for those presentations entirely by himself, painstakingly breaking down layered, complex distributed system technical logic into straightforward, accessible business value takeaways that even stakeholders with zero background in software engineering or data infrastructure could easily grasp and evaluate for commercial viability. The communication breakdown Victor cited as justification for removing him from leadership had never once stemmed from Ethan's inability to translate technical concepts for non-technical audiences. It had always originated from the willful disengagement of the investors and board members Victor prioritized above everything else, stakeholders who arrived at technical deep dive meetings preoccupied with golf outings, wine tastings, and superficial brand growth narratives rather than devoting the mental bandwidth required to listen to granular architectural design explanations that formed the core tangible value of Cloudscape's product offerings. They had never bothered to pay attention to the detailed breakdowns he spent dozens of overtime hours drafting for their benefit, and now their deliberate inattention was being weaponized as a manufactured professional flaw to push him out of his leadership role and clear a path for Victor's unqualified cousin Jason to claim the associate director title and all investor-facing corporate prestige attached to the architecture department leadership position. The company's official formal request is that you submit a voluntary resignation letter effective 1 week from today, following completion of a full technical handover of all ongoing active project repositories and client infrastructure deployments, Victor stated finally, lowering his voice to a near-hushed murmur as if terrified any passing engineer outside the closed office door might overhear the forced separation demand and spark internal labor unrest among the engineering staff, sliding a single printed one-page severance outline sheet across the tea table toward Ethan's elbow for him to review the financial terms laid out in black and white. The pre-negotiated severance package approved unanimously by the board follows standard N+1 industry separation compensation protocol for senior leadership employees with 6 years of continuous tenure. The company will repurchase all of your vested employee stock options at their original initial strike price, with no market value depreciation deductions applied against the payout. And I will personally lobby the finance department to authorize an additional 3 full months of base salary disbursed as a discretionary one-time retention bonus on top of the mandatory severance payment outlined in the formal separation agreement. Ethan, you are an intelligent, reasonable man with a well-established professional reputation within the national smart city engineering sector. Accept this voluntary resignation offer and walk away from Clouscape with full professional dignity intact. No formal termination records entered into your HR employment file to complicate future job searches with competing tech firms operating in our industry vertical. A heavy, suffocating silence settled thickly over the enclosed executive office room for multiple unbroken seconds, the only ambient background noise the distant low, constant rumble of rush-hour street traffic flowing along the arterial road outside the industrial park's perimeter fencing, filtering faintly through the double-glazed window panes lining the far wall of Victor's office space. Ethan slowly set his filled teacup back down on the carved wooden tea tray, his gaze fixed on his own wavering, distorted reflection rippling across the smooth amber surface of the brewed June May tea liquid filling the cup, a flood of vivid, bittersweet memories flashing rapid-fire through his mind in unordered fragments, triggered by the weight of Victor's forced resignation demand hanging in the air between them. He recalled his very first day walking through Clouscape's cramped original 3-floor office space 6 years prior, Victor personally leading him down a narrow concrete corridor into the basement server room lined with row upon row of rack-mounted server hardware. Clapping a hand on his shoulder and gesturing broadly at the banks of whirring machines as he made a grand, unfulfilled promise. All this server infrastructure, all the technical systems we build together in the coming years, one day all of this will be yours to lead and shape as the company's core technical architect. He replayed the celebratory dinner held 3 years earlier in an upscale downtown restaurant to mark Clouscape's official winning bid for the initial Starling City Smart Traffic Project tender. Victor raising a crystal wine glass high above the crowded dining table to toast Ethan in front of the entire engineering and sales team, declaring loudly for everyone present to hear. Without Ethan's unmatched architectural design work and round-the-clock troubleshooting through every tender roadblock, there would be no viable Clouscape bid for this landmark municipal contract today. This company owes its biggest client win entirely to his dedication and technical genius. He remembered the private closed-door meeting 6 months prior where Ethan had formally submitted a fully detailed, budgeted written proposal to launch an in-house technical innovation lab dedicated to researching next-generation edge computing digital twin simulation technology for future municipal smart city tenders. Victor smiling warmly and clapping him on the shoulder in enthusiastic approval before brushing off the request with a vague delaying promise. Wait a small amount longer to launch the lab, hold off on allocating dedicated engineering headcount and research funding for the time being. Once we successfully complete our pre-IPO funding round and formally list the company on the public stock exchange, we will immediately greenlight your innovation lab proposal with an unlimited independent annual research budget and full authority to hire your own dedicated research team of senior engineers. None of those glowing verbal commitments, none of the grand promises of future leadership autonomy and dedicated research resources had ever materialized into tangible corporate action. Instead of the fully funded technical innovation lab, he had spent weeks drafting a detailed business case to pitch to executive leadership. He had received nothing more than a meticulously staged, temperature-controlled ceremonial cup of parting June May black tea brewed to exactly 95 degrees Celsius. A hollow symbolic gesture meant to soften the brutal blow of being pushed out of the company he had built from its startup infancy to a 12-floor industrial park enterprise with hundreds of employees and multi-million-dollar municipal client contracts. Victor, he heard his own voice speaking out loud, calm, flat, and completely emotionally detached, as if he were objectively discussing a professional scenario unfolding for a stranger rather than confronting the collapse of 6 years of his own blood, sweat, and dedicated labor poured into Cloudscape's technical infrastructure, every syllable measured and unrushed without a hint of raised voice or bitter resentment bleeding through his tone. Is this entire forced resignation restructuring decision solely to clear a senior leadership position for Jason to step into as Associate Director of Architecture? The mild, practiced, affable expression Victor had maintained throughout the staged tea ceremony froze solid across his facial features in an instant, like a thin sheet of black ice sealing over the surface of a pond on a frigid winter night, all traces of his carefully cultivated warm camaraderie vanishing without a trace. He sat ramrod straight upright in his armchair, tapped his index finger twice in sharp, deliberate succession against the polished sandalwood tea table surface as a silent display of executive irritation at Ethan's direct, unflinching question cutting through his rehearsed corporate talking points, and his vocal tone sharpened abruptly into a cold, authoritative reprimand aimed at correcting Ethan's perceived insubordination for connecting the restructuring plan to Jason's arrival back in Starling City. Ethan, allow me to state this matter with absolute, unambiguous clarity to eliminate any misguided speculation on your part. This organizational restructuring mandate is a formal cross-board strategic business decision reached collectively by every member of the company's board of directors after months of internal financial and growth planning analysis. It bears zero connection to any single individual employee's recent hiring or internal promotion trajectory whatsoever. I requested this private one-on-one closed-door meeting with you personally purely out of deep respect for the 6 consecutive years of loyal labor you have dedicated to building Cloudscape's technical systems from the ground up. If you insist on reading unsubstantiated personal ulterior motives into a neutral corporate board-level strategic realignment decision without factual evidence to back up your assumptions, that mindset strikes me as profoundly ungrateful toward the countless professional opportunities this company has afforded you over your 6-year tenure as head of architecture. Okay. That single soft, quickly uttered monosyllabic response landed so lightly and unexpectedly in the charged silence of Victor's executive office that every pre-planned rebuttal, threat, and procedural warning Victor had meticulously prepared to deploy if Ethan refused the voluntary resignation offer became lodged unspoken in his throat, unable to escape past his lips. He blinked rapidly twice in stunned, disbelieving shock, his facial expression shifting instantly from stern, disciplinary executive irritation to confused, startled disbelief at how effortlessly Ethan appeared to accept the devastating professional news without argument, pushback, or visible emotional distress. You fully agree to submit the voluntary resignation letter under the outlined severance terms we have presented to you today? I agree, Ethan confirmed without hesitation, lifting the now lukewarm Celadone teacup filled with the remaining June May tea liquid and draining the entire contents in one single unbroken gulp. The faint fleeting warmth of the steeped black tea sliding across his tongue vanishing within a split second, leaving only a dry, bitter, astringent aftertaste that clung thick to the back of his throat and sank downward to settle heavy in his chest, burning far sharper and more painfully than the hot tea liquid itself ever had against his throat lining. The Starling City Smart Traffic Digital Twin Platform project carries an extremely complex underlying technical architecture, with core decision-making logic spread across 7 interdependent interconnected service modules that rely on layered cross-system data dependencies and custom proprietary simulation algorithms I engineered specifically for this municipal tender's unique traffic modeling requirements. I require a minimum of 1 full uninterrupted workweek to complete a comprehensive, fully documented technical handover covering every repository, configuration center parameter, third-party API integration, production incident runbook, and regression test suite tied to the platform's development and deployment lifecycle. Once I finish every item listed on my formal handover checklist and cross-sign all knowledge transfer documentation with Jason and the operations department lead, I will submit my fully completed voluntary resignation letter to HR for formal processing. A fleeting flicker of wary, suspicious unease crossed Victor's eyes for half a heartbeat as he briefly wondered whether Ethan might be plotting some hidden act of professional sabotage buried within the week-long handover window. But the momentary flicker of doubt was instantly swallowed whole by overwhelming, profound relief washing over him at the knowledge his worst-case nightmare scenarios had been entirely avoided. He had spent hours the night prior brainstorming contingency plans to mitigate two catastrophic potential outcomes of confronting Ethan with the resignation demand. First, that Ethan would rally the entire engineering department's senior lead engineers to submit mass simultaneous resignations in solidarity with their departing head of architecture, stripping Klauscape of all core institutional technical knowledge mere days before the critical Starling City bidding round. Second, that Ethan would walk out of the building immediately upon hearing the news without completing any technical handover work, taking critical proprietary project knowledge and access credentials for the unfinished $16.8 million tender platform with him, and leaving Jason and the remaining junior engineers unable to resolve technical bugs or run valid demo environment verification tests for the municipal bidding panel. As long as Ethan cooperated fully to complete a thorough, documented technical handover of every Starling project asset before submitting his resignation, every risk Victor had feared would be neutralized entirely, and the company's pre-IPO timeline and bidding prospects would remain safely on track without disruptive engineering department backlash or incomplete project knowledge transfer gaps. Absolutely. Of course, we will accommodate the full one-week handover timeline you require to wrap up all Starling project knowledge transfer materials. Victor's vocal tone warmed instantly back to its earlier artificially affable, cordial register, and he even reached across the tea table to refill Ethan's Celadone teacup with a fresh half-serving of brewed June May black tea as a symbolic peace offering to reinforce the illusion of amicable separation between them. We all fully recognize how irreplaceably critical the entire Starling City's smart traffic platform project is to Klauscape's immediate short-term corporate growth and long-term pre-IPO funding success trajectory. I place complete unwavering trust in you to execute every element of the technical handover process thoroughly and professionally for Jason to take over ownership of the architecture department's ongoing project delivery responsibilities moving forward. Your full base salary, quarterly performance bonus eligibility, and all standard corporate benefits will continue uninterrupted as normal for the entire duration of the one-week handover period without any partial prorating or withheld compensation cuts. No shortchanging of your contractual financial entitlements during this transition window. I give you my personal guarantee on that front. Ethan pushed his wooden chair backward away from the tea table, rose slowly to his feet, and offered Victor a small, minimal, non-committal nod of acknowledgement without speaking a single additional word to respond to the hollow financial guarantee the CTO had laid out before him. I will head back to my workstation now. There are still several final stress test performance metrics I need to run and log into the project's shared technical documentation repository before the end of this afternoon's work shift. He pivoted on his heel and turned to walk out of Victor's private executive office, his spine held rigidly straight, shoulders squared back with deliberate, unyielding composure. No slump or defeated hunch to betray the crushing professional betrayal weighing heavy inside his chest. The solid oak office door clicked shut with a soft, muted snap behind his retreating frame the moment he stepped across the threshold back into the open-plan engineering workspace, sealing Victor's quiet, relieved sigh of relief inside the isolated executive office room, separating the CTO's world of self-serving corporate restructuring scheming from Ethan's quiet, calculated plan to leave behind a perfectly legal, untraceable technical trap embedded deep within the Starling project's core load. Balancing configuration layers before his resignation date arrived at the end of the handover week. Upon returning to his unassuming workstation tucked between two frosted glass partition dividers in the middle of the 12th floor engineering floor, Ethan did not immediately sink back down into his ergonomic office chair to resume his half-finished stress test metric logging work. He stood motionless beside the desk surface for an extended long moment, his unblinking gaze fixed intently on the sprawling, intricate microservice topology diagram rendered across the three linked monitor screens positioned before him. Dozens of independent backend service nodes woven together by thousands of bidirectional API data flow connections, real-time sensor data ingestion pipelines, predictive algorithm calculation modules, and visualization front-end rendering services interlocking seamlessly like veins and arteries pumping digital data blood through the living, breathing organism of the Starling City Traffic Digital Twin platform. He had spent 4 months of unbroken late nights designing, coding, testing, and refining from a blank repository slate to a fully functional pre-production-ready technical stack. For calendar months of backbreaking crunch labor, 160,000 lines of handwritten, annotated production-grade code split between newly built modules and refactored legacy middleware, 32 major feature Git commits logged under his developer account, countless sleepless 3 a.m. office nights fueled by cheap vending machine coffee and cold takeout meals sacrificed to perfect every minor architectural detail of the tender project that Victor and Jason planned to strip him of credit for and claim as Jason's own leadership achievement during the upcoming municipal bidding presentation in front of dozens of rival tech firms and municipal government evaluation panel members. He drew one deep, slow inhale of air to steady his racing thoughts, lowered himself into his worn office chair, and rested his calloused fingertips lightly atop the mechanical keyboard's keycaps, pausing for roughly 10 full silent seconds to mentally map out every single technical step he needed to execute to embed the dormant experimental latency degradation load balancing logic into the project's persistent production configuration. Center storage, all operating entirely within his fully authorized senior architect administrative account permissions without bypassing a single layer of corporate security audit logging or access control protocol, ensuring every action would be fully traceable to his developer account, yet legally untouchable, as an act of corporate sabotage by Cloudscape's legal team after the fact. Then he lifted his fingers and began typing rapidly into the terminal window open on his left monitor screen, moving through the code repository directory tree with the effortless, instinctual muscle memory of a senior engineer who had navigated this exact project file structure tens of thousands of times over the past 4 months of development work. First, he navigated into the private, restricted access central Git code repository dedicated exclusively to the Starling City Smart Traffic Digital Twin Platform project, scrolling through the root directory's lengthy list of configuration YAML files until he located an obscure, rarely modified environment configuration file bearing the file name applicationoversight.yml, a file only accessed during pre-production environment validation cycles and almost never reviewed by junior engineers or non-technical department leadership like Jason, who would never bother to dig through low-level backend configuration directories during his rushed, surface-level handover walkthroughs with Ethan over the coming week. Inside the file's top-level configuration block, tucked between dozens of unrelated hardware compatibility parameter lines that drew zero attention during routine configuration audits, he inserted a single unremarkable line of human-readable comment text formatted to blend seamlessly with the surrounding existing annotation blocks without standing out as a deliberate modification. #legacy fallback for version 2.3 roadside sensor hardware compatibility, deprecated since 2024, Q3. The generic comment line served as a mundane, plausible cover story to explain the presence of the dormant experimental degradation load balancing logic he planned to activate in the core load balancing module immediately afterward, framing the latency-inducing code branch as a harmless leftover hardware compatibility fallback mechanism long since marked deprecated and used in active production deployments for over a full calendar year prior to Ethan's modification that afternoon. Next, he navigated deeper into the project's core backend service directory tree to locate the independent load balancing microservice module folder labeled Load Balancer Adaptive, the critical codebase responsible for distributing incoming concurrent user and sensor data requests evenly across the platform's pool of application server instances to regulate overall system response latency and prevent single server resource overload during peak simulated traffic concurrency testing for the municipal bidding demo environment. Inside the module's primary strategy selector logic source code file, He embedded a simple, cleanly structured timestamp-based conditional branch into the existing load-balancing routing decision algorithm. The underlying code logic written with immaculate, industry-standard clean coding practices that would pass every automated static code analysis scan and peer engineering code review without triggering any error or warning flags to alert Cloudscape's operations team of the intentional latency degradation mechanism he was activating within the production stack. The conditional logic operated on a straightforward binary trigger rule. If the system environment variable store detected a specific obscure alphanumeric flag string set within the configuration center's persistent runtime parameter storage table, the load balancing service would automatically switch its active request routing strategy into a hidden, rarely used, high-latency compatibility mode, pulled from a 9-month-old rejected intern optimization proposal archived deep within the project's historical feature branch archive. While the platform's core functional simulation logic would continue running perfectly normally on the surface, without any visible broken features, crash errors, or unhandled exception stack traces to flag catastrophic system failure to the bidding panel's demo environment monitoring screen, every single incoming client and sensor data request routed through the access layer gateway would be forced to endure an additional fixed 600 millisecond artificial waiting delay before being forwarded onward to the back-end calculation servers for processing. The cumulative 600 millisecond latency penalty applied uniformly to every individual concurrent request would compound exponentially as simulated traffic concurrency levels climbed higher during the mandatory bidding demo environment stress test phase, sending the platform's overall response latency metrics skyrocketing far above the strict numerical threshold limits outlined in the municipal tender's formal technical evaluation criteria, triggering an automatic immediate disqualification of Cloudscape's entire bid submission mid-demo verification without any possibility of last-minute emergency hotfix deployment to resolve the performance degradation in time to salvage the tender win. This dormant, high-latency compatibility mode, load-balancing routing logic Ethan reactivated and embedded into the main production code branch that afternoon had not been invented out of thin air as a malicious custom backdoor written exclusively to sabotage the Starling project's bidding demo performance. Its core code implementation originated from a formal optimization proposal submitted to the Cloudscape architecture department by a summer intern engineering student 9 full months prior to Ethan's forced resignation meeting with Victor in the CTO's private office. Ethan himself had personally reviewed and formally rejected the intern's proposed latency adjustment scheme at the time of submission after running exhaustive benchmark stress tests that proved the fixed 600 millisecond request delay would cripple the platform's peak concurrency performance metrics and violate municipal tender latency requirements, but the intern's complete source code implementation had never been fully deleted from the project's historical feature branch archive repository, instead simply labeled with a prominent, experimental, not recommended for production deployment warning tag and archived indefinitely without further modification or removal from the codebase over the subsequent 9 months of active project development work. All Ethan was executing that afternoon was retrieving the long-dormant, pre-existing experimental latency degradation routing logic from its neglected historical archive branch and writing its activation trigger parameter into the configuration center's permanent persistent runtime storage table via the Enterprise Configuration Management Platform's fully supported standard administrative interface, every single step of the process completed using his own fully authenticated senior architect administrator account with complete operational audit logging capturing every individual mouse click, terminal command, and configuration write operation he executed on the system infrastructure that afternoon. Every action falling entirely within the scope of his pre-resignation authorized administrative access permissions outlined in Cloudscape's internal IT security governance policy handbook distributed to all engineering leadership staff at the start of every fiscal year. At no point throughout the entire modification workflow did Ethan bypass any corporate identity authentication, access control permission layer, audit logging pipeline, or production environment change approval process mandated by Cloudscape's official IT operations security protocols. He followed every single written internal company rule to the letter, leaving an unbroken, transparent paper trail of every configuration adjustment he made to the Starling project's core load balancing runtime parameters prior to submitting his voluntary resignation letter at the end of the upcoming one-week handover window. Once he finished embedding the conditional latency degradation branch into the load balancing module's source code and updating the persistent configuration center parameter table to enable the experimental routing scheme upon the next full production environment release cycle, he entered the standard git save, commit, and push terminal commands to upload all modified source code and configuration file changes to the project's central remote code repository server hosted within Cloudscape's internal private cloud infrastructure. A short plaintext system notification line popped up automatically at the bottom of his terminal window to confirm the successful repository upload operation. Commit 7A3F9D2 config update pushed successfully. He stared silently at that single line of confirmation text displayed across his monitor screen for several unblinking seconds, mentally visualizing the cascading performance failure chain reaction this simple, legally untraceable configuration modification would trigger once Jason carelessly authorized a full untested production environment release ahead of the municipal bidding demo without completing the mandatory full regression test suite. Ethan would document exhaustively within the formal handover checklist to be ignored and buried beneath expired tender filing documents in a bottom filing cabinet drawer the moment Jason received the physical paperwork from Ethan at the end of the handover week. Then he closed the open terminal window with a single keyboard shortcut, erasing all visible traces of the configuration modification workflow from his workstation's active screen display without deleting any underlying audit logs or repository commit records stored permanently on Cloudscape's internal server infrastructure. This subtle, pre-existing experimental latency degradation routing scheme embedded into the Starling project's core load balancing module was not a malicious custom backdoor access point designed to steal proprietary client data or trigger catastrophic, unrecoverable production system crashes, not a self-replicating virus or destructive worm script that standard enterprise security scanning software could flag as high-risk malicious code during pre-bidding demo environment vulnerability audits. Not a deliberately broken, untested code block that would generate obvious runtime crash errors and exception stack traces immediately visible to the municipal bidding panel's technical evaluators monitoring the demo environment's live performance metrics on the giant central hall display screen during the verification phase of the tender process. It was nothing more than a long-archived, previously rejected alternative load balancing routing scheme that Ethan had merely reactivated and written into the platform's permanent persistent configuration storage at the exact critical moment right before the formal final pre-bidding production configuration validation cycle required by the municipal tender's official technical submission rules, an entirely legitimate, documented historical code variant pulled from the project's publicly archived feature branch repository, activated fully within Ethan's authorized pre-resignation administrative access scope, leaving zero legally actionable evidence of intentional corporate sabotage that Cloudscape's internal legal department could use to file civil liability claims or pursue criminal misconduct charges against Ethan after the bidding demo catastrophic performance failure disqualified the firm from the $16.8 million Starling City Smart Traffic tender contract. Every individual step of the configuration modification workflow complied 100% with Cloudscape's written internal IT security governance, code repository management, and production environment change control policies, rendering any potential legal retaliation against Ethan completely unenforceable and legally groundless. A fact he had calculated and verified through hours of reviewing the company's official employee IT policy handbook stored on the shared corporate intranet knowledge base prior to executing the configuration adjustment that afternoon. Ethan leaned backward fully into the supportive padding of his ergonomic office chair once more, tilting his head upward to stare blankly at the suspended ceiling panels stretching across the entire 12th floor engineering workspace above his workstation. Watching one flickering overhead fluorescent tube pulse dimly on a slow, consistent electrical cycle that emitted a low, monotonous, continuous electrical hum blending seamlessly with the distant whine of the basement data center's industrial cooling ventilation systems circulating chilled air upward through the office floor's underfloor air distribution ducts. A line of philosophical text he had stumbled across years earlier while reading a vintage technical leadership book on software engineering risk mitigation floated unbidden to the forefront of his mind, a quiet, resonant observation that perfectly encapsulated the subtle, legally untraceable trap he had embedded within the Starling project's core production configuration layers without deleting a single line of functional code, corrupting any critical client data, or triggering immediate, visible system failure upon deployment. A true hunter never digs obvious, easily detectable traps that draw immediate attention and allow prey to escape before triggering the fatal consequence. They simply guide the prey steadily toward the deep, unmarked abyss that already existed within the landscape all along, waiting dormant and unseen for the prey to step forward voluntarily and seal their own fate through careless, unexamined action that the hunter cannot be held legally or professionally accountable for creating or triggering. The dormant experimental latency degradation load balancing logic had existed as a harmless archived code variant within the project's repository for 9 full months before Ethan activated its runtime trigger parameter, the only variable required to unleash the catastrophic tender disqualifying performance failure was Jason's predictable refusal to follow the mandatory full regression testing checklist Ethan would meticulously document and hand over to him at the end of the 1-week technical handover period. A reckless oversight entirely outside of Ethan's direct control or actionable responsibility once his voluntary resignation took formal effect after completing the full knowledge transfer process as requested by Victor and the board of directors. At precisely 9 o'clock the following morning, Jason Joe arrived punctually at the 12th floor engineering department workspace as scheduled, carrying the polished, self-assured aura of a newly promoted senior corporate executive stepping into a leadership role he believed he had fully earned through his Stanford MBA credential and superficial Silicon Valley product management work history. Completely oblivious to the dormant latency degradation trap Ethan had embedded deep within the Starling project's core production configuration center storage tables the prior afternoon during his private meeting with Victor in the CTO's executive office. Jason dressed for his first official day overseeing the architecture department's outward-facing technical strategy and investor relations deliverables in a tailored premium charcoal cashmere overcoat layered over a form-fitting soft light blue merino wool turtleneck sweater, an expensive mechanical automatic wristwatch fastened around his left wrist with a brushed metal link band bearing a luxury brand logo Ethan could not immediately identify with a single glance yet instantly recognized as a 5-figure timepiece marketed exclusively to wealthy venture capital partners and high-level corporate executive leadership across the tech industry. His dark hair had been meticulously styled with matte texturizing hair product to hold a sleek, polished side part free of stray, unruly strands, and thin, frameless rectangular eyeglasses perched lightly on the bridge of his nose caught the harsh white overhead office LED lighting to cast faint, sharp glints across his eye sockets as he scanned every individual engineer's workstation face spread across the open-plan 12th floor workspace with the systematic, sweeping gaze of a corporate radar sweep cataloging every subordinate employee under his new associate director leadership jurisdiction. He walked forward into the center of the engineering floor's main walkway carrying a paper Starbucks cold brew coffee cup in one hand and a thick black leather padded laptop briefcase slung from his opposite shoulder, moving with effortless, practiced breezy confidence honed through 2 years of Silicon Valley investor networking events and corporate product stakeholder presentation cycles, his head held high with unshakable self-assurance that bordered on unearned arrogance toward the senior engineering staff who had spent 6 years building Cloudscape's entire technical infrastructure without his participation or contribution to any core project delivery work. "Good morning, everyone." Jason projected his greeting in a clear, Amplified speaking voice pitched perfectly to carry uniformly across every workstation desk positioned on the entire 12th floor open-plan floor without requiring him to raise his volume to a shout, the polished, well-rehearsed delivery cadence of a corporate keynote speaker trained extensively for formal team onboarding announcements and investor-facing public presentations. I'm Jason Zhou, the newly appointed Associate Director of Architecture for Cloudscape Technologies, moving forward effective immediately as part of the company's pre-IPO organizational restructuring initiative announced by the Board of Directors yesterday afternoon. I will be fully owning all external client technical presentation delivery, venture capital investor relations, technical deep dive sessions, and the architecture department's long-term corporate strategic growth planning roadmap for the foreseeable future. I'm genuinely looking forward to collaborating closely with every single one of you on the engineering team to deliver outstanding municipal smart city project outcomes for our client partners and lock in our upcoming pre-IPO institutional funding round over the next fiscal quarter. He stood motionless dead center of the main office walkway for a full 30 seconds after delivering his opening onboarding speech, his gaze continuing to slowly pan across every engineer's workstation to register every individual reaction to his leadership introduction, preemptively positioning himself as the sole public-facing technical authority of the department moving forward while deliberately sidelining Ethan's 6 years of foundational architectural design work into unmentioned, low-level implementation, back-end labor with zero outward-facing corporate visibility or investor presentation opportunities attached to his role during the handover week before his voluntary resignation took formal effect. A small cluster of senior back-end engineers seated at adjacent workstations exchanged quiet, knowing sideways glances with one another the moment Jason finished his rehearsed introductory speech, their facial expressions flicking with unspoken quiet skepticism and muted frustration at the sudden unplanned executive restructuring that had stripped their respected head of architecture Ethan of all leadership authority to hand a completely unqualified external hire with zero hands-on distributed system engineering experience, the entire department's public-facing investor and client presentation portfolio. One mid-level senior engineer seated 3 rows back from Jason's standing position muttered a quiet, under-his-breath remark to the colleague sitting beside him along the lines of, "Another overhyped corporate airborne parachute hire with no real back-end delivery experience to speak of, only to receive a sharp, subtle elbow nudge from the adjacent engineer beside him as a silent warning to refrain from openly criticizing the newly appointed associate director within earshot of other team members or Victor's office down the far end of the floor. Fearful of triggering internal HR disciplinary action or negative performance review feedback logged against their employee files for public dissent against executive restructuring decisions mandated by the board of directors. Victor personally escorted Jason across the open-plan engineering floor walkway to a vacant workstation desk positioned directly adjacent to Ethan's existing long-term workspace, a desk that had been occupied full-time by a dedicated senior data pipeline engineer responsible for maintaining the Starling project's real-time sensor data ingestion streams as recently as the day prior to Jason's arrival. An engineer who had received an abrupt, unplanned HR relocation notice first thing the previous afternoon, instructing him to pack up his workstation and transfer all project ownership materials to a temporary spare desk tucked away at the far opposite end of the 12th floor hallway to clear the prime adjacent workstation space for Jason's exclusive use as the new Associate Director of Architecture moving forward through the handover week and beyond. Victor raised one palm to clap Jason firmly on the shoulder blade in a public display of executive endorsement loud enough for every engineer seated within 3 full rows of surrounding workstations to clearly hear his explanatory introduction speech, framing Jason's leadership credentials as superior to Ethan's accumulated 6 years of hands-on technical delivery experience for the entire department to witness firsthand. Team, please welcome Jason to our architecture leadership team as Associate Director, reporting directly to my office as CTO moving forward. Jason is a highly accomplished senior technical management talent freshly returned to Starling City after 2 years of Silicon Valley AI startup product leadership experience paired with a Stanford MBA graduate business degree, with an impeccable Industry-leading professional resume full of investor growth strategy and cross-border technical stakeholder communication expertise critical to our upcoming pre-IPO funding push. Moving forward into the handover period for the Starling City Tender project, Jason will hold full executive ownership of all external technical presentation delivery and the architecture department's high-level corporate strategic leadership responsibilities, while Ethan will remain in his current role through the end of the week to ensure a smooth, comprehensive technical handover of all ongoing project repositories, client deployment runbooks, and internal system configuration assets, directly to Jason's oversight. Victor's public framing of Ethan's remaining tenure as nothing more than a temporary, transitional, technical resource there solely to hand over assets to his newly promoted cousin landed like a cold, heavy stone in Ethan's chest. But he kept his facial expression completely neutral, his fingers continuing to type slowly and steadily into his code editor as if he had not heard a single word of the CTO's announcement. He had already calculated that any public pushback, any visible display of anger, any attempt to correct Victor's deliberately misleading narrative about his role and Jason's qualifications would only play into the executive team's hands, allowing them to paint him as an uncooperative, emotionally volatile employee unfit for leadership and potentially use that characterization to withhold parts of the severance payout outlined in the formal separation agreement. He had no intention of giving them that leverage. Jason spent the first 2 hours of his first day in the new role taking casual meetings with department heads across sales, operations, finance, and human resources, posing for several staged corporate headshots with the in-house marketing team to update the company's public leadership page and pre-IPO investor organizational chart, and reviewing a polished slide deck prepared for him by Victor's executive assistant that outlined the high-level strategic priorities for the architecture department over the next 12 months. At 11:30 a.m. sharp, he finally walked over to Ethan's workstation, pulled out the office chair positioned beside Ethan's desk, and sat down casually, placing his leather-bound notebook and expensive mechanical pen on the desk surface beside Ethan's monitor stand with an air of relaxed, entitled confidence. "All right, Ethan," Jason began, leaning back in the chair and crossing one ankle over his opposite knee, his tone casual and faintly patronizing, as if he were speaking to a junior intern rather than a senior architect who had built the entire technical foundation of the company over 6 years. "Let's get this handover process rolling. I need you to walk me through the Starling City project's high-level architecture first, then give me access to all the repositories, documentation, and demo environment credentials so I can start prepping for the bidding presentation next week. The investors and municipal panel members don't need to hear every granular engineering detail. They just want to see a clean, compelling narrative about how our platform outperforms every competitor's offering on the market." Ethan paused his typing for a long, silent beat, then turned slowly to face Jason, his expression calm and unreadable, no flicker of irritation or resentment visible in his eyes. The high-level architecture narrative is in the project's shared documentation repository, folder path/Starling City/docs/presentation/. The demo environment access credentials are stored in the company's enterprise password manager under the account name Starling Demo Admin. I'll send you a full handover checklist by end of day today, covering every repository, configuration center parameter, third-party API integration, production incident runbook, and regression test suite you'll need to take over ownership of the project. Jason waved off the detailed checklist with a dismissive flick of his wrist, picking up his smartphone to glance at a new calendar notification that popped up on the screen. "No need to overcomplicate it with a massive checklist, Ethan. I don't need every single low-level configuration detail memorized. My team of junior engineers will handle the day-to-day implementation work once I officially take over the department. Just give me the high-level talking points for the bidding presentation, make sure the demo environment runs smoothly for the panel, and we'll be golden. The last thing we want is to bore the municipal evaluators to death with hundreds of pages of technical documentation they'll never actually read." Ethan said nothing in response, turning back to face his monitors and resuming his typing without another word. Over the next 3 days, He compiled a comprehensive 127-page technical handover document that covered every single aspect of the Starling City platform's architecture, from the lowest-level distributed database tuning parameters to the highest-level predictive algorithm training data sources, complete with annotated topology diagrams, step-by-step demo environment deployment instructions, and a detailed regression test checklist that explicitly warned against activating any archived experimental load balancing routing schemes without completing a full 24-hour stress test under simulated peak concurrency load. He saved the document to the project's shared documentation repository, sent a formal email to Jason, Victor, and the operations department lead with a link to the document and a request to schedule a formal sign-off meeting to review the handover materials together, and waited. The meeting never happened. Jason replied to the email 4 hours later with a short, dismissive message. "Thanks for putting this together, Ethan. I've reviewed the high-level sections and it looks solid. I'll go through the low-level implementation details with the engineering team next week after the bidding presentation is over. No need for a formal sign-off meeting. We can consider the handover complete once you've transferred all repository access permissions to my account." Ethan read the reply once, then closed the email window without responding, updating the repository access permissions to grant Jason full administrative access to every Starling project codebase and configuration center storage table as requested. He had done everything required of him under the terms of the separation agreement and the company's internal IT governance policies. He had documented every critical system component, warned explicitly about the risks of untested experimental configuration changes, and transferred full administrative access to the incoming associate director. The rest was out of his hands. On the final day of the handover week, Ethan packed up his personal belongings from his workstation, a worn canvas laptop bag, a chipped ceramic coffee mug Clara had given him for their 3rd wedding anniversary, a small potted succulent that had sat on his desk for 4 years, and a stack of dog-eared technical reference books he had accumulated over 6 years of engineering work. He left the framed photo of Clara and him on their wedding day sitting on the corner of the desk, a quiet, deliberate choice that would remind Jason and Victor exactly who had built the company's most valuable technical asset every time they sat at his former workstation to work on the Starling project. He walked out of the 12th floor engineering workspace without saying goodbye to anyone, declining to attend the casual team happy hour the engineering department had planned for the end of the week to wish him well in his future endeavors. He knew if he stayed, he would likely say something he would regret, or worse, allow himself to show the quiet, crushing grief he felt at leaving the company he had built from the ground up for a family member who had contributed nothing to its success. He took the elevator down to the ground floor of Tower C, walked out into the crisp autumn air of the industrial park, and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, staring back up at the 12th floor windows that had been lit up at 3 a.m. so many nights over the past 4 months of crunch time for the Starling project. Clara was waiting for him in the car parked at the curb, having taken the afternoon off work to drive him away from the industrial park for the last time. She got out of the car when she saw him walking toward her, wrapping her arms around him tightly without saying a word, holding him for several long seconds as the full weight of the past week's betrayal settled fully onto his shoulders. He buried his face in her shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of her lavender shampoo, and for the first time since Victor had summoned him to his office to deliver the forced resignation demand, he allowed himself to cry, quiet, silent tears soaking into the fabric of her coat as the industrial park's afternoon traffic flowed past them on the arterial road behind the car. "Let's go home," Clara said softly, rubbing slow, gentle circles on his back with one hand, and he nodded, pulling himself together and climbing into the passenger seat of the car beside her. She drove them out of the industrial park, heading west toward the small suburban townhouse they shared on the other side of the city, the golden afternoon sunlight slanting through the car windows to warm his face as he stared out at the passing city streets, watching the familiar storefronts, office buildings, and residential neighborhoods blur past him in a steady stream. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan slept. He slept until 10 a.m. every morning, took long naps in the afternoon, and spent evenings cooking dinner with Clara, watching old movies, and going for long walks around the neighborhood park near their townhouse. He did not check his work email, did not reach out to any former colleagues, and did not follow the news about the Starling City bidding round scheduled to take place at the end of the second week after his resignation. He had done everything he needed to do, and the rest was none of his concern. On the morning of the bidding presentation, he woke up at 9:30 a.m. to the sound of his phone vibrating repeatedly on the nightstand beside the bed. Dozens of missed text messages and incoming call notifications flooding the screen from former colleagues at Closcape. He ignored them all, rolling over to wrap his arm around Clara's sleeping form, and stayed in bed for another hour before getting up to make coffee and cook pancakes for breakfast. By mid-afternoon, the news had spread across the entire Starling City tech industry. Closcape's Starling City Smart Traffic Platform demo had failed catastrophically during the municipal bidding presentation, with the platform's response latency spiking to over 12 seconds per request during the mandatory peak concurrency stress test, far exceeding the 200 millisecond threshold outlined in the tender's technical evaluation criteria. The municipal bidding panel had immediately disqualified Closcape's bid submission mid-demo, and the company's pre-IPO funding round had collapsed within hours of the public failure, with multiple institutional investors pulling their commitment letters and demanding repayment of their initial seed investment funds immediately. Victor called Ethan's personal cell phone that evening, his voice shaking with rage and panic, screaming accusations of sabotage and professional misconduct into the receiver, demanding Ethan return to the company immediately to fix the catastrophic failure and save the bidding round and funding round from total collapse. Ethan listened to Victor's rant for 3 full minutes in complete silence, then said simply, "I have no contractual obligation to provide technical support to Closcape Technologies following my voluntary resignation and completed handover process. All system configuration changes I made prior to my departure complied fully with the company's written IT security governance policies and were documented in the handover materials provided to your Associate Director of Architecture, Jason Zhou. You can reach him for support during regular business hours." He hung up the phone before Victor could respond, blocked the number, and turned off his phone completely, setting it down on the kitchen counter beside his plate of leftover pancakes. Clara looked up from the book she was reading on the couch, raising one eyebrow in a silent question, and Ethan smiled, walking over to sit beside her and wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Work stuff," he said simply, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head. "I don't work there anymore." Over the next 3 months, Closcape unraveled rapidly. The company laid off 70% of its engineering, sales, and client services workforce within 6 weeks of the bidding failure. Unable to meet payroll or service existing municipal client contracts without the pre-IPO funding round they had been counting on to keep the business afloat, Victor stepped down as CTO and CEO within 2 months, and the company's remaining assets were sold off to a rival smart city tech firm for pennies on the dollar of its pre-IPO valuation. Jason Zhou left Starling City within a week of the layoff announcements, returning to California to take a junior product manager role at a small SaaS startup. His brief tenure as Associate Director of Architecture at Closcape becoming a forgotten footnote on his resume. Ethan did not follow any of the news closely, having spent the 3 months after his resignation resting, spending time with Clara and working on a small side project he had been tinkering with in his spare time for years. An open-source distributed database optimization tool designed specifically for municipal smart city workloads, built on the same tuning algorithms he had developed for the Starling City project. He released the tool for free under an open-source license at the end of the 3 months, and it quickly gained traction among municipal government IT teams and small smart city tech firms across the country, who praised its low latency, high scalability, and compliance with strict data sovereignty regulations for public sector workloads. 6 months after leaving Closcape, Ethan launched his own startup, a small boutique urban digital infrastructure firm focused on building open-source, cost-effective smart city tools for small and mid-sized municipal governments across the region. He hired 3 former senior Cloudscape engineers who had been laid off during the company's collapse, rented a small 1,000-square-foot office space in a converted warehouse in the downtown arts district, and started building a team focused on delivering tangible, high-quality technical solutions without the corporate politics, nepotism, and empty investor grandstanding that had defined his tenure at Cloudscape. On the first day of operations for his new startup, he stood in the small open-plan office space with his 3 new employees, holding a box of donuts and a pot of freshly brewed coffee, and smiled as he looked around at the empty desks, the whiteboard covered in technical architecture sketches, and the large window looking out over the bustling downtown street below. "Welcome to the new company," he said, raising his coffee cup in a toast. "No empty promises, no nepotism, no 3 a.m. office nights unless we're all here voluntarily and getting paid overtime for it. We build things that work, we treat our clients and our employees with respect, and we never prioritize investor narratives over good engineering. Sound good?" The 3 engineers cheered, raising their own coffee cups in agreement, and Ethan took a sip of his coffee, looking out the window at the sun rising over the downtown skyline. For the first time in 6 years, he felt genuinely, completely happy, free from the weight of unfulfilled promises and corporate betrayal hanging over his shoulders. He had built something new, something entirely his own, and this time, no one could take it away from him.